The rain poured down in heavy sheets that night, soaking through her thin coat as she clutched her notebook close to her chest. The city lights flickered in the puddles at her feet, and the cold wind bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding with the same words she had heard earlier that day, words meant to break her, to make her question everything. "She's dreaming too big," they had laughed. "She'll never make it." They had said it so casually, so confidently, as if they'd already decided her future for her. The boardroom had been filled with smirks, eyes filled with amusement rather than belief. She had stood there, her hands gripping the edge of the table, presenting her ideas with passion, only to be dismissed before she could even finish. She had expected resistance after all. Ambition often threatens those who choose comfort over courage. But she hadn't expected them to mock her, to turn her drive into a joke. That was the moment something inside her shifted. It wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving to herself that she had been right all along. So, she walked home through the storm, her shoes heavy with water, but her steps filled with determination. She had nothing, no support, no resources, no one backing her vision. But she had herself, and that would have to be enough. Nights turned into weeks, and weeks into months. She worked in silence, building something they said was impossible. She spent hours refining her skills, learning everything she needed to know. There were nights she barely slept, days she barely ate, but she refused to give up. Every rejection fueled her. Every doubt only made her stronger. Slowly, things began to change. One small win led to another. Her work started gaining attention, and the same people who had laughed at her now watched in silence. First, it was curiosity. Then, it was disbelief. And finally, respect. The calls started coming in. The same voices that once dismissed her now spoke with hesitation, with interest. They wanted to meet, to discuss opportunities. They wanted a chance to sit at her table, the very table they had once refused to build with her. She held the phone in her hand, staring at the names on the screen. People who had doubted her, ignored her, laughed at her. Now, they were reaching out. The power had shifted. She took a deep breath, the weight of years of struggle pressing against her ribs. This was the moment she had worked for. The moment they never saw coming. And now, she had a choice to make. That phone kept ringing. Her fingers hovered over the screen, the names staring back at her, people who had once dismissed her without a second thought. The ones who rolled their eyes when she spoke, who exchanged amused glances behind her back, as if her dreams were nothing more than a joke. Now, their voices carried a different tone, polite, almost careful. They needed her now. She let the call go to voicemail. Not out of pettiness, but because she wanted to sit with this moment, to fully absorb what it meant. Just a few years ago, she had stood in front of these same people, trying to convince them she had something valuable to offer. They hadn't even listened. Now the tables had turned. She set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, looking around the office she had built from nothing. The walls were lined with ideas, plans, sketches, reminders of late nights and early mornings. She could still remember those first days, when doubt crept in like an uninvited guest, whispering that maybe they were right. Maybe she was chasing something too big. Maybe she was foolish for believing in herself when no one else did. But she had kept going. Through every setback, every sleepless night, every moment when it felt like the world was closing in on her, she had pushed forward. Not because she was fearless, but because she refused to let fear win. The first real breakthrough had come when she least expected it. A small opportunity, one that others might have overlooked, had opened the first real door. She had thrown herself into the work, proving what she already knew. She didn't need their approval to succeed. Success had been slow at first. A few clients, a few small victories. But momentum is a funny thing. It builds, gains speed, becomes unstoppable. And that's exactly what happened. Now, She was sitting at the top of something they never saw coming, and they wanted in. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Another request for a meeting. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her hair. She should have felt triumphant, but instead, something else settled in her chest. A question. Did they really see her value now? Or were they just trying to save themselves? She knew how this world worked. People didn't suddenly change overnight. They weren't reaching out because they believed in her. They were reaching out because they saw what she had built, what they had missed out on, and now they wanted a piece of it. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The same street she had walked years ago, lost in her thoughts, wondering if she was making a mistake. Now she was here, looking down from an office that was entirely hers. But success hadn't erased the memories. The way they had laughed, the way they had dismissed her, the way they had spoken over her in meetings, as if she wasn't even there. Those scars didn't fade, no matter how high she climbed. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "It's happening, isn't it?" Her closest friend and business partner leaned against the doorway, a knowing look on their face. She nodded. "They're calling." "Of course, they are." They stepped inside, dropping a folder onto her desk. "You built something they can't ignore anymore." She traced a finger over the edge of her desk, lost in thought. "And now, they want a seat at the table." Her friend sat down across from her. "The question is, are you going to give it to them?" She didn't answer right away. Because deep down, she wasn't sure. She had spent years fighting to be heard, to be taken seriously. Now, they were the ones knocking, asking for a chance. The irony wasn't lost on her, but neither was the weight of the decision she had to make. She had always known that success would change things. She just never realized how much. And as she stared at the list of names on her phone, she couldn't help but wonder, was this victory? Or just another battle waiting to begin? The messages kept coming. Each one, a variation of the same thing: requests for meetings, carefully worded apologies that didn't quite feel like apologies, sudden admiration for her work, as if they had always believed in her. She read them without emotion, without responding. They had once treated her ambition like a joke, and now they wanted to be part of her success. But why now? That question lingered in her mind, gnawing at her even as she tried to push it aside. She knew better than to assume they had changed. People don't suddenly become different just because the circumstances do. The same voices that once shut her down were now reaching out, not because they saw her worth, but because they saw an opportunity. That was the way the world worked. Still, something in her hesitated. Not because she wanted their approval, she had moved past that a long time ago, but because she wanted to understand. Did they regret how they had treated her? Or did they simply regret underestimating her? Her thoughts were interrupted when her assistant knocked lightly on the door, stepping inside with a hesitant look. "There's someone here to see you." No appointment. She didn't have to ask who. She already knew. One of them had decided to come in person. With a steady breath, she nodded. "Send them in." A few seconds later, the door opened, and there they were, the same person who had once dismissed her ideas with a smirk, sitting across from her now, hands folded, voice suddenly measured and respectful. "I know you're busy," they began, "but I wanted to speak with you personally." She leaned back, watching them carefully. There was no sign of the arrogance they once carried. No amused glances, no quick dismissals. But she wasn't fooled. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. "I won't take much of your time," they continued. "I just want to say, we were wrong." The words hung in the air. Simple, direct, yet strangely hollow. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied them, letting the silence stretch between them. "What exactly were you wrong about?" she asked, finally. The person hesitated, as if choosing their words carefully. "About you. About your vision. We didn't see it back then." But we do now. She let out a quiet breath, barely a reaction. This wasn't about admitting their mistakes. It was about rewriting the past in a way that benefited them. Why now? She asked. Why not then? They shifted slightly, as if uncomfortable with the question. Things were different back then. The industry, the market, we weren't sure if it was the right time. She almost laughed. Not sure if it was the right time? That was their excuse. She had heard those words before, in different forms. The polite way people dismiss what they don't understand. The careful way they mask their disbelief. She had built her success, not because of them, but in spite of them. Now, they sat across from her, acting as if they had simply miscalculated. I'm sure you understand how business works, they continued. Sometimes, people make mistakes in judgment. But we see the potential now. And we'd love the opportunity to collaborate. She stared at them for a long moment. They weren't here because they had changed. They were here because they had lost. Because she had proven them wrong, and now they wanted a way in. I'll think about it, she said finally. The person nodded, as if satisfied with that answer. But she wasn't giving them hope, she was giving herself time to decide. Because this wasn't just about business. It was about knowing who she could trust. And right now, she wasn't sure if any of them deserved a seat at her table. She watched as they left her office, their expression carefully composed, but she could see the tension in their posture. They were nervous. Nervous that she wouldn't say yes. Nervous that she held all the power now. It was a strange shift, one she had imagined countless times. But now that it was real, it didn't feel as satisfying as she once thought it would. She had dreamed of this moment, of seeing the people who once dismissed her, forced to acknowledge her success. But standing here now, she felt something else, something deeper than victory. There was an edge to it, an awareness that this wasn't over yet, because the same people who had underestimated her were now desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. The days that followed were filled with more calls, more emails, more carefully worded messages. Some were polite, professional. Others were more urgent, almost pleading. And then there were the ones that came with subtle warnings, the ones that hinted at what could happen if she didn't agree to work with them. At first, she ignored them. But then, small things started happening. A deal she had been working on for months suddenly stalled without explanation. A partnership that had seemed solid began to waver. People who had once been eager to work with her started hesitating, their words vague, their enthusiasm dulled. She knew what was happening. The same people who had laughed at her, who had refused to take her seriously, were now trying to control what they could no longer ignore. If they couldn't benefit from her success, they would try to weaken it. She had expected resistance, but this was something else. This was calculated, deliberate. And that's when she realized this was never about collaboration. It was about control. They didn't just want a seat at her table. They wanted to own it. They wanted to turn her success into something they could claim, something they could reshape in their favor. And if she didn't give them that, they would find other ways to make her pay for it. She sat alone in her office, staring at the city lights outside, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. They had underestimated her once, and now they were trying to force her into a choice, either let them in or risk everything she had built. But they had forgotten something. She hadn't come this far by letting fear decide her future. If they thought they could break her now, they were about to learn just how wrong they still were. She had prepared herself for pushback. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't expected what came next. The first sign was subtle, just another deal slipping through her fingers. At first, she thought it was coincidence. A partner backing out, citing unforeseen circumstances. But then, another opportunity fell apart. And another. People who had once been eager to work with her now hesitated, their responses vague, their excuses unconvincing. Something was happening behind the scenes. and she knew exactly who was behind it. They weren't just trying to pressure her anymore. They were trying to isolate her, to make her feel as though the empire she had built was suddenly unstable. It was a move meant to make her doubt herself, to push her toward desperation, the kind of desperation that would make her accept their offers. But she wasn't the same person they had underestimated all those years ago. She started digging, reaching out to her contacts, tracing the pattern of setbacks, until the truth became undeniable. They weren't just pulling strings to block her progress. They were actively working to take what she had built. Deals she had once fought for were now being redirected. Partnerships she had secured were suddenly considering other offers. And at the center of it all were the same people who had once laughed at her ambition. But it wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. Then came the real blow. A former ally, someone she had trusted, had switched sides. She saw the announcement online before she even received a call. Someone who had stood by her during the hardest moments, someone who had once believed in her vision, was now working with them, aligning with the very people who had dismissed her, who were now trying to erase her from the very space she had fought to claim. She stared at the screen, reading the words over and over, waiting for the sting to fade. But it didn't. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a message. They weren't just trying to take her success. They were trying to take the people around her, to leave her standing alone. And for a brief moment, she felt it, that flicker of doubt they wanted her to feel. But then, something inside her shifted. They wanted her to believe she was losing, that she had no choice but to let them in, that she had to surrender. But they had made one fatal mistake. They thought they were backing her into a corner. They had no idea she had been building an entirely different way out. She didn't waste time. If they wanted to play this game, she would show them she had already won before they even made their first move. While they were busy trying to isolate her, she had been preparing for something much bigger, something they never saw coming. They thought they were cutting off her opportunities, but what they didn't realize was that she had been creating new ones in silence. While they focused on controlling the spaces they thought mattered most, she had been building relationships in places they never bothered to look. So, when they pulled their final move, thinking they had her exactly where they wanted, she was ready. The morning of the big announcement arrived. They had been planning it for weeks, carefully positioning themselves, making sure everyone believed they were the ones leading the industry now. It was meant to be the moment they solidified their power, the moment they made it clear that she was no longer a threat. But what they didn't know was that she had her own announcement. As they stood on stage, talking about their new direction and exciting partnerships, the news broke. She had secured a deal that made theirs look like an afterthought. A partnership so powerful, so unexpected, that it completely shifted the conversation. And by the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. The media picked it up instantly. Investors turned their attention to her. The people they had tried to sway away from her, they came back, not just as allies, but as firm believers in what she had built. And the one person who had betrayed her? They reached out, attempting to explain, to justify their decision. But she didn't need their explanation. The truth was already clear. They had chosen the losing side. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Because as she stood there, watching the chaos unfold, she realized something even more satisfying than proving them wrong. She had never needed them. Not for approval. Not for validation. Not for success. And now, they knew it too. The dust settled slowly. The headlines continued for days, industry conversations shifting entirely in her favor. The people who once overlooked her were now scrambling to align themselves with her vision, but she had already moved on. She had no interest in proving anything anymore. The work spoke for itself. Her office felt different now, lighter, calmer. The weight of fighting for a place at the table was gone, because she had finally realized she didn't need their table at all. She had built something far more powerful. something they could no longer touch. The calls didn't stop, but now they came with a different tone. Instead of empty apologies and carefully worded excuses, there was respect in their voices. Genuine or not, it didn't matter. She had the choice now who to let in, who to keep at a distance. And for the first time, she felt no obligation to explain herself. She took her time deciding what came next. The success she had fought for was now hers, but she knew this wasn't the end. There was more to build, more to create. But this time, it would be on her own terms. One evening, as she sat by the window, watching the city glow beneath her, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The laughter behind closed doors, the dismissals, the betrayals. Every obstacle had only made her sharper, more determined. And now, standing on the other side of it, she realized she wouldn't change a thing. She had proven them wrong, yes, but more importantly, she had proven herself right. And as she turned off her phone, letting the unread messages wait for another day, she smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't chasing anything. She had already arrived.